First of all, hello everyone, welcome, and thank you for helping out with the technicals. This is a group effort. And I'm going to have a slide in 3 slides about who I am, so maybe I'll jump straight into what we're speaking about today. And I feel like this was a case study, and so many pieces of my life are a case study of how simplicity is the answer, and perhaps we take a while to get there. And I have a little time here to remind me to tell you a story of what happened yesterday, which is I went to a concert with Leah, and I checked my emails one last time, and only at 9 p.m. realized that the talk today wasn't going to be an hour, but half an hour. And so I ended up going home and simplifying the talk. Now, I don't know how good of a job I did, and you can judge me on that by the end of today, but it's a representation of what we'll be sharing, or what I'll be sharing with you. And so today we'll be looking at the paradox of simplicity. And we'll be looking at simplicity applied to creativity, and how simplicity can help with the creative process and can help us simplify the creative product, and yet could be a big hindrance when we apply it to the creator, so to who you are in your creative identity. Ooh. So I will try to convince you today that your most untapped creative resource is you, and that designing for simplicity can help the creative process and product, but when applied to your identity as a creative, it limits your creativity. Freeing yourself from the urge to oversimplify your story and who you think you are is, in my mind, the key to unbounded creativity. This can be achieved through 2 tools that I'm going to share with you, which is the power of embracing paradox and the power of community, which Creative Mornings knows very well. So who am I to say all of this? I'm a trained behavioral scientist, so I studied for 10 years the science of decision-making and transformation, and I'm also a transformational coach. So 5 years ago, I started my own practice to apply all of this behavioral science to real-life scenarios and people. And so in my coaching practice, I help entrepreneurs and creatives define their personal and professional goals, design their life for more meaning, and expand their sense of self and of possibility. I put a little thing here to also tell you that I love to dance. I also love to organize something that I call food and pleasure parties. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, come and see me afterwards. And I also love to speak to strangers. So let's have loads of conversations later. So now to you. Raise your hand if you identify as a creative. Okay, we have like an 80-90%. Beautiful. So this is the Creative Morning Manifesto, which you might know, and always gives me shivers when I read it. And the very first sentence is, everyone is creative. This is because whether we work in a creative industry or not, our life is a creative process. We need to make decisions all the time. We need to choose how we present ourselves. Living is a creative process. And so I'm really going to invite you, even the ones who didn't put your hand up, to really feel that this talk is about you, because you are a creative, whether you work in the creative industry or not. Now, let's start with this little feeling of community. So I'm going to invite you to turn to the person next to you and to introduce yourself in a couple of sentences. We're short on time, as you know, so let's keep it short. Turn to the person next to you, 2 sentences one and 2 sentences the other. So now you've gotten to know each other a little bit more, and I'm going to invite you to try to remember what you shared. If you don't, it's okay, you won't be tested on it, but there'll be a little question about it later. So, back to the talk, the paradox of simplicity. How simplicity can help the creative process but hinder the creator, and what to do about it. Let's jump into some terminology. So what is simplicity? I simply looked on the dictionary and I found that simplicity is defined as the fact that something is easy to understand or to do. So it has a concept of ease in it. Simplicity etymologically comes from the word simplex in Latin, which means a unitary part, so the simplest form in all of matter. Now, what is creativity? And you can look at this cool little pop art picture that brings together loads of great artists. Creativity is the ability to produce or use original and unusual ideas. So there's two parts of creativity. Either you're creating something completely new that's never been done before, or you're recombining existing elements into a new form or a new shape. Now, as Robert Franken, a professor, says, in order to be creative, you need to be able to view things in new ways or from a different perspective. So you need to be able to put on new glasses every single day. And that requires flexibility, it requires tolerance of ambiguity, and the enjoyment of things unknown. So let's let that sink in, because that's going to be really important for today. A question for you again. How do you think simplicity boosts creativity? And I'm asking you this because I started doing a very big research and realized that a lot of the tools I was finding on how simplicity helps creativity are things that I'm already doing in my everyday without thinking about it. Because I feel like we've already been taught in many ways that simplicity can help the creative process and the creative product and our planning and perhaps even our identity. So I'm going to ask you, how does simplicity boost creativity? You can just put your hand up like it's shown here on the cue. Yes?
Maybe it's about like decluttering the
Mm-hmm.
mind
Mm-hmm.
Eliminating distractions.
to allow the ideas to emerge.
Beautiful. Yes? Yeah.
Deciding to give away the things that doesn't serve anymore.
Wonderful. Yeah, beautiful. Mm-hmm.
I would actually argue, because in design, when you try to reach the simplicity, that's where the difficulties appears.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure actually if it boosts it, or do you need to kind of like, it might be that it boosts it in the way that it challenges you to simplify.
Mm-hmm.
So it forces your creativity to go, like to I don't know, I don't find the word in English, to kind of like revisit your idea over and over to reach the simplicity. But I'm not sure if boosting is the right word, because it might be very complex.
Yeah. So you're sharing how simplicity might not only be about helping the process, but it can actually be a motivation for the creative process.
Definitely.
Wonderful. Anything else? Yes?
Yeah, another word for me for simplicity is clarity. And for me that means, being really clear, what are we doing? Why am I doing it? And be really sharp.
Yeah.
And what's the purpose? What's behind? How is it going to be used, etc., etc. And be very clear.
Beautiful.
The other thing I would just add is ease and calm. Creativity not as a frantic process, but also as a tranquil process of allowing ideas to form from a more peaceful place.
Beautiful. Well, see, you guys are this is the beehive intelligence, and you've named a lot of, these are just some examples. I also want to say that it sounds like all of you could have given this talk with me, so next time we can do a joint talk. But yeah, so you've mentioned some of this. Simplicity can help by having simpler tools that speed up the process. We can clear distractions. We can impose self-constraints on how many options we have, which is really important as creatives. With increasing technology, we can narrow down our vision. We can simplify the story, simplify the product, even if this comes at the end of the process. We can focus on specific tasks. We can break down our goals. We can make sure that we have spaciousness in our mind, in our physical space, so that creativity emerges. So there's many ways in which simplicity helps the creative process, the planning, and the product. Now, I love this this quote of making the simple complicated is commonplace. Making the complicated simple, awesomely simple, that's creativity. I want to mention how important that is in today's era, where with increasing technology, especially as creatives, we have an incredible choice overload. If I'm just taking this talk, I could have used any image, I could have used any format of slide, I could have used any content. There's so much research that I've done that works with this theme, and yet I had to choose. And what can happen when we have too many options is that we get paralyzed in our decision making because it just feels like too much and we freeze, and it can create anxiety and angst and confusion. So simplicity can be a solution because it helps us to consciously limit our options and create constraints that allow our creativity to emerge from more clarity and more structure, so that this doesn't happen. Less is more. Now, one more piece where simplicity can be helpful is in your identity as a creator or in the way you walk in the world. So if you say, I am X, so for example, I am a web designer and I do websites for conscious brands, the world knows who you are. So this manages your opportunities. You know what to say yes or no to, you know what conferences to go to or not. You're easier to track by other people because they know exactly what you do, and it constrains your creative options as well. And I'm going to bring in here the example of Joy. I've changed her name for anonymity, who's a person that I worked with, and she's going to be with us on this little journey. And Joy was a web designer for conscious brands. And when we started working together, Joy was very clear on what she had to do. She went to all the web design conferences, she was reading all the web design books, she was getting in communication with conscious brands to understand their needs. There was a simplicity in who she was that allowed her to focus on her creative tasks. And when is it simply too simple? And what I'm going to focus on today for this kind of other side of simplicity, so simplicity can be greatly useful. On the other side, simplicity, especially when applied to our identity, as I just shared Joy's story, can be a great limitation to the creative process. This is because, as creatives, we are inherent rule breakers. Literally, our job is to understand the local rules of what has become the norm and to break them. So we need to constantly go against what is accepted. This comes as a conflict with our deeper human need to conform, to belong, to be part of a group, and to be seen as such. And so as a creative, there's this inherent tension between the creativity we need to have in our work and the urge to conform. And one thing that might happen is that we apply creativity to our work, and yet in order to belong to society, we limit our identity, and we stop being creative in how we define ourselves. And so the question is, how does your story limit your creativity? So let's zoom in a little bit on what identity is. Identity is ultimately a story. It's a story that we tell to make sense of the world and so other people can know who we are. It's a story that's practiced, that's repeated, and that's solidified across time and space. Other people around us reaffirm our identity by telling us you are this and you are not this, and by punishing us when we deviate from that identity. And we may also punish other people when they deviate from who we think they are. Because we practice it, we repeat it, and we solidify it across time, we end up believing this identity is true, and we end up believing that the bounds of our world are a lot smaller than they actually are. And this is a reminder to tell you more about the story of Joy. So Joy was a web designer for conscious brands, and no one knew that she was actually trained as a therapist, and that her dream was to be a therapist. Now, the only person she had told this to was her partner, but her partner laughed at her. He said that didn't match who she was, and she ended up just putting her therapy books away and assuming it was just a dream that she had to forget about. This is what limited identity does. Now, we think we see the world as it is, when in fact, we see it as we are. I'm going to bring in a little concept called the mind is flat, who was actually designed from one of my favorite professors that I studied with during my master's. His name is Nick Chater. And he realized that a lot of the human biases and irrationalities and the way we seem to deviate from normal behavior can be explained by our urge to conform. So all of what we do is done to be consistent with a certain story of who we are. This has evolutionary sense because this means that we are more approachable and understandable by other people and we fit better in the group. But this comes at a cost. Being loyal to our own story rather than to our creativity or to our freedom really limits who we think we can be in the world. Now, an example of this is cognitive dissonance. Who here has heard of cognitive dissonance? You can put your hand up. Oh, great. Amazing. So cognitive dissonance is what happens. It's a tension that arises when we are holding two seemingly opposite concepts at once. Now, there's no problem with cognitive dissonance. That's a very normal biological effect. And our bodies start feeling tense because there is this inner conflict happening. But it can become problematic when we try to solve the tension. And this is something that has been found in a lot of research. When cognitive dissonance arises, what most people do is they try to solve the conflict by simplifying the story. So instead of looking at this contradiction and saying, hey, maybe there's something I need to understand, they usually choose one or the other as the reality because it creates less cognitive effort and it allows us to be consistent with the wider story of who we are. Now, I'm going to give you again the example of Joy. Joy felt like she had to choose between her therapy identity and her identity as a web designer. She felt like it was an either or. And because also of the conversation she had with her partner, ended up choosing one of the two, leaving behind a massive part of who she was, and which potentially had a lot of creative potential for her. Another thing I want to mention about this story is that because of her sadness of leaving behind this dream of hers, her web design work was actually starting to get affected. So the thing that she ended up choosing ended up really suffering from her pretending that the other part didn't exist. So from the amazing Adam Grant, author who wrote an amazing book called Think Again, highly recommend, we favor the comfort of conviction over the discomfort of doubt. Now, if we go back to how we defined creativity at the very start as something that requires flexibility and tolerance of ambiguity and the enjoyment of things unknown, what we see is that our urge for consistency, our urge to oversimplify who we are and our story comes at the cost of creativity. Now, we're back at the manifesto. One more thing that creativity really requires because of all of this is bravery and action. So a creative life requires bravery and action, honesty, and hard work. And this is because as creative people, we have the extra challenge of not only being creative in how we show up in the world, but being creative in our work. This means, as we said before, that we often have to go against social norms and that we're often taken by this conflict between do we go with a tradition or do we choose invention. What not many people speak about is that there is something in our biology that tells us this comes at a risk of being ostracized from our group. Because if we go a little bit too much at the edge of what is accepted and understood, we may be pushed away. And this could be even in tiny ways at work, just being dismissed for having a creative idea. And this is especially the case in times of crises. I was doing research on this week, and COVID, for example, was a moment in time where creative ideas started being pushed out more because there was a moment of crisis. We go more into our survival mode, and anything that is outside the bounds of what is known becomes threatening. So creativity takes courage. Now, how can we shape identity to our creative advantage? So I've painted you a little picture of how we make our identities smaller and how this can really impact our creative process. And it's something that we don't really speak about in creative workshops. We speak about the process, the product, but who speaks about the creator? And so let's take everything we've learned and look at how we can actually use this concept to increase our creativity. And this is when you got to remember what you said in the introduction. And so try to tune back in. So when you introduced yourself to your neighbor, what did you use? What did you say? So show of hands, who spoke of your job? Beautiful. Who shared where you're from? Okay. And who shared another role, like a mother or a helper or some other role that you have in society? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So these are all beautiful categorizations of who you are. They are wonderful, kind of sometimes fixed identities that are very important and help us understand who we are and what we stand for. And they're an incredibly limited version of you. What would happen if instead you would introduce yourself as, I'm a passionate human who loves to stare into people's eyes? Example, you can try it at the next party. Now, I'm going to invite you to jump with me into this very powerful tool that I discovered in the last year, which is the power of paradox. So we looked at cognitive dissonance before, right? Which is the idea of holding two concepts that are seemingly opposite and trying the urge that we have to try to solve that tension by creating an oversimplified version of reality. Paradox is exactly the opposite. Paradox is the appearance of contradiction between two related components, but while cognitive dissonance pushes us to resolve the tension, paradox challenges us to straddle the tension of the two conflicting elements and recognize they can both be true at the same time. Now, a paradox mindset, so a mindset that really trains us to see the wider complexity of life and allows us to hold seemingly opposite concepts at the same time, expands our story. It directly counters our urge to oversimplify our reality, and it helps us develop the capacity to actually hold the complexity of the world, the complexity of the tasks we have to do, the complexity of who we are. Now back to Joy. This is something that we applied in our work together. And she started realizing that the cognitive dissonance she felt around therapy and her web design might not be a contradiction, but a paradox to accept, to embrace, and to work with. I can say today that Joy has a small but thriving therapy business and that she's still doing her web design work, but guess what? She's changed her niche and she's now working only with therapists. So not only is she a small-scale therapist, she is now also a web designer, continuing to get the revenue that was making her feel safe, but focusing on the niche and the passion that she really cares about. This shows us how when we embrace paradox, we can be incredibly more creative. Although paradoxes often trip us up, embracing contradictory ideas may actually be the secret to creativity and leadership. And now I actually removed those slides because I thought we wouldn't have time, but I'm going to tell you in a couple of sentences here that a lot of research has been made on the theme of paradox, especially in organizations. And what they found is that people who were asked to hold seemingly contradictory goals, like increasing cost effectiveness and increasing innovation, actually ended up being a lot more creative than people who only had one goal, so one of the two. So had to be only cost effective or only innovative, which is counterintuitive. You'd think that if you're only focusing on innovation, you'd actually be more creative, but no. What one of my favorite researchers on this, Ella Myron-Spector, shares is it's in the conflict, it's in the contradiction that the creativity emerges. On a mind level, it's just like we try to make sense of the world and we create this oversimplified version, and then comes the contradiction. And if we embrace the contradiction, our mind kind of breaks. It just like stops functioning because the equation doesn't work anymore. And often from that breaking emerges something we couldn't have imagined with the parameters we had to start with. Here's, to finish, a couple of examples of people who have done this. So you may not know Daniel Kahneman. He's one of the founders of behavioral economics, which is one of the fields that I studied. And he was in one of the unique people who brought psychology back into economics. So he was actually nominated for the Nobel Laureate Prize because of his willingness to let go of his identity as either an economist or a psychologist and merging them to create something new called behavioral economics that has incredibly helped policymaking, individual decision making, and also branding. But that's another talk. And then we have Tina Roth-Eisenberg, who many of you might know is the founder of Creative Mornings, and who had to embrace a lot of different identities in order to be where she is today. She started off just being a visual arts designer, and then just by wanting more community, ended up becoming the founder of a global community of creatives that come together like this every month. She is also now the founder of an app that helps with to-do lists, and she has also started her own company of temporary tattoos. So if Tina was in a mindset of limitation, if she tried to be consistent with her story of the start of being a Swiss entrepreneur in New York, she would have never gotten to where she is today. Creativity comes from a conflict of ideas. Okay, so the booster to all of this, so we're now all convinced that paradox is a great tool to challenge our limited identities. The real booster for this is the power of community. And we'll go one last time to the Creative Mornings Manifesto, which mentions we believe in the power of community. We believe in giving a damn. We believe in face-to-face connections and learning from others, in hugs and high fives. So as we shared before, being a creative is hard. It involves a lot of risks, and it involves risks also at a social level, which we may logically not think about, and yet our biological bodies are confronted with on a daily basis. So it's really important to have creative support networks, groups like this, where we come together as change makers, as rule breakers, to allow ourselves to be in our full creative identity and to explore, to play, to be in this openness together. But I'm going to argue that we also need trusted challenge networks. So these are networks of trusted people that can point to us when we are oversimplifying our story, when we are trying to create simplicity over simplification of something that is actually really complex, and how that's impacting us in our creativity as a human and in our creativity in our work. And I love this little piece, which is the definition of conversation, or like the etymology of conversation is actually turning together. So what if conversations were, again, the place where instead of just saying what we already believe and are convinced of, what if conversations were the place where we experiment, where we test, and where we turn together? Mystery is at the heart of creativity. That and surprised by the amazing Julia Cameron. So this is my simplicity slide, which is a little summary of the whole talk. It's got loads of circles, and it's maybe not that simple, but I tried. That shows us that simplicity can increase creativity, especially when it comes to the creative process, the planning, and the product. But simplicity can also shrink our creativity, especially when it comes to our identity as a creator. But what can help us counter this is the power of paradox and the amazing booster we all know about, the power of community. So I hope I could convince you today that your most untapped creative resource is you, that designing for simplicity can help the creative process and product, but when applied to your identity as a creative, limits your creativity. Freeing yourself from the urge to oversimplify your story is the key to unbounded creativity. And this can be achieved by embracing paradox and by using the power of community. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Silba Staffler, transformational coach and behavioral scientist. And there's little hands again, because this is when you can ask questions if you want. Right? We can do questions?
Good. I was
Yeah.
going to say, take questions. If anyone has any questions for you, go for it.
And that's just while we ask questions. That's a little promotion of who I am. Let's keep in touch. You can send me an email. I also have a weird newsletter about food, pleasure, and sensuality if you're interested. And you can follow me on Instagram at Silba Staffler. And the questions.
Maybe we could, maybe if any of you have another take on simplicity, or you feel like there's something that wasn't picked up enough, maybe that now's also the time to, does anyone else have, when you, go ahead.
Yeah, what went on in my mind was the opposite of simplicity is probably complexity. So I believe we live in a very complex world, and we are very complex human beings. So how far can I go with trying to simplify and still recognizing that if I do too much, I'm not appreciating the complexity I'm dealing with.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and it's open for discussion, right? It's the great challenge that we're in. How can we simplify enough to make sense of the world and be able to be an active agent in the world, but not simplify too much that we end up acting in biased ways? And I think the balance is different for every person. I know my tolerance for complexity is very high, and that's just because I'm a very passionate, jumping around person. And I know that for other nervous systems and other people, it just doesn't work. They actually need a lot more structure. They need to be able to conform more to the global narrative as well. So I personally think, and my experience of working with clients is that it's a personal balance to find, but that we can only find by experimenting. We can't assume that what we're doing is the right balance for us, because often what we're doing is just a result of habit or what we've learned from the people who came before us, rather than really a process that a result we've come to through experimentation.
There was another question.
Yeah.
Could you also just say your name when you say we can come back?
Yeah. My name is Toon, and I wanted to ask about the other side of the same coin. To simplify means you start somewhere more complicated, so how much do you have to embrace complexity before you start simplifying? How deep do you need to dive before it starts to make sense, before you know enough to start simplifying?
Yeah, and I would say my answer is the same,
Yeah,
right?
that's-
Yeah. And that's what I love about behavioral science and behavioral economics, is that everything they do is based on experimentation. So yes, there's hypothesis like every single science, but what behavioral economists love to do is that whenever they have an idea, they just go and test it out in the field, and they get real data from that. And I think we can all have a more scientific lens to our lives and really run experiments and gather the data, even if it disconfirms actually how we think the world works. But my invitation really is to stay in that experimentation. And maybe you can even put every month a moment where you have an experimentation setting session with yourself of okay, this month I'm going to experiment with this piece, next month with that one, and to be able to really hold yourself accountable. But this is, again, last piece, this is again where the power of community is so important. Because if you have trusted people around you, you can start experimenting together, and they can start pointing out when you are either oversimplifying or you're getting lost in complexity. Yes?
I think, just more of a comment that how I see simplicity is more as a tool that I pull out at different points. So it's not
Yeah.
it's either simple or complex.
Yeah.
At the start, if I want to dive into a new subject, I will simplify it to focus, then go really deep, then simplify again, and then it's a constant kind of play of the paradox or both.
Yeah.
So you kind of pull it when you need it, but it doesn't mean that everything has to be constantly simplified all the time.
Yeah.
That you will never get to the depth of things.
Exactly. And I love this idea of really using simplicity as a tool and not as a norm. And that's really where we can move towards. Yeah. Thank you. Yes?
So maybe not a question, just First of all, thank you for your talk. I think it was extremely simplified, or in a way easy to grasp, and it kind of like created a lot of creativity, or like linked of concept. And you said something very interesting in at some point. You mentioned that simplicity is clarity, and that reminded me vividly of a conference of design ops that I've been to, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was the head of design of Twitter who mentioned that clarity is kindness. And I think all what you mentioned at the end was also about this, how do you call it, psychological safety. So this kindness, and I think Tina also mentioned that in her, how do you call it? It's not a webinar, but not a blog. Well, she mentioned that when she created the Creative Morning, she needed to bring this sense of kindness in the community. So, and you kind of like had that part. So I think maybe what I will keep out of your talk is that simplicity can also be linked of this clarity, and there is this sense of kindness. And when you have this feeling of psychological safety, then you can become even more creative in the community. So, yeah. So thank you for this really deep but simple talk.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and thank you for adding that. I feel like it fits in very well, and it resonates with how this talk was created, of the process this week. Of it started with a lot of big concepts, and me being like, oh, I'm so smart, I know so many things, and then actually having that moment of, wait, but I'm literally going against what I'm speaking about, and how to keep the complexity but share it in a way that is clear and understandable and relatable, is definitely the hardest process of all of this. So yeah, I love this. Simplicity is kindness. And clarity is kindness. Yes. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Because if not, I would sort of say, unless you've got a last question, I would say we could close that now, and then we still have some time left to have another kind of chat with each other.
Can I just add, it's not about the talk, but thank you. And we definitely will have some time to speak a bit more. I'm also part of the team for organizing, and as we spoke about community, one of the goals that we have is, of course, to have you all here and that everybody is happy. But we are also looking for volunteers for specific tasks or for general tasks. So around 10 today, so in half an hour when you have time for a coffee. If some people are interested, want to know what we need, I think we definitely could do with photographers, videographers, some people who want to do community or networking, helping people arriving in this room and speak to each other, because it can be the difficult part. We can find roles for anyone, and it can be regular or some points sometimes following how much you can get involved. So feel free to come speak with me or Brady, or at 10 we'll probably, when everybody starts to go, we'll start to be together. So just so you know. Or you just take your time and you come back and again, and then at one point you will come to us. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So, Silba, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Je voulais juste dire que c'était absolument incroyable. Je suis venue ici par hasard parce qu'en fait j'ai réécouté le podcast. Je suis désolée, j'étais un peu émue. De Tina, justement, que vous avez mentionné à la fin. Et je me suis dit que ça s'appelait Creative Morning. Et je viens d'arriver à Bruxelles. Et du coup, je me suis dit, tiens, je vais regarder s'il y a des Creative Morning. Et je viens ici. Et tout ce que vous avez dit, c'est incroyable. J'en ai des frissons. Je suis psychologue. J'ai un PhD en psychologie. J'ai travaillé avec des designers. En fait, tout